Ronald Reagan was trying to negotiate a free trade agreement with Canada. That's inconceivable now with the current administration, which has openly perceives Canada as a kind of enemy on trade. What I thought was interesting about Doug Ford's play was that it really puts the fox and the chickens in the Republican Party about what Reagan's legacy is. It asks some very uncomfortable questions about the Trump administration and its relationship to this legacy president.
Ronald Reagan hasn't been president of the United States since the late 1980s, years before the internet was a thing. But in recent weeks, the Republican and conservative icon has become a major talking point in North American politics, at the center of an increasingly bitter trade dispute between two formerly close allies, Canada and the United States. It's become the ultimate narrative cage fight to wrest control over Ronald Reagan's economic legacy, pitting U.S. President Donald Trump against Ontario Premier Doug Ford, two of the continent's most successful and combative conservative populists, in a no-holds-barred public relations battle royale. Trump suspended trade talks with Canada due to the Reagan imbroglio and threatened to slap an additional 15% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the U.S. So why all the fuss about Ronald Reagan? What is Ronald Reagan's economic legacy, and why does Ronald Wilson Reagan still matter? I'm Adrian Harewood, and this is In Bed with the Elephant. The cross-border controversy that erupted over former U.S. President Ronald Reagan's legacy stemmed from an anti-tariff ad paid for by the Doug Ford-led Ontario government that ran on U.S. TV networks during prime time.
When someone says, let's impose tariffs on foreign imports, it looks like they're doing the patriotic thing by protecting American products and jobs. And sometimes for a short while it works, but only for a short time. High tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. Then the worst happens.
The minute-long ad featured Reagan speaking into a microphone and stating his opposition to the use of tariffs as part of trade policy. The clips of Reagan were taken from a national presidential radio address he delivered in 1987 at the height of a trade dispute with Japan. In it, Reagan argues against protectionist policies and champions free and fair trade. The ad drew the ire of Trump, who claimed it was a big lie designed to mischaracterize Reagan's true beliefs about tariffs and trade. Trump insisted Reagan, quote, loved tariffs for our country and its national security, end quote. He said that the ad was fraudulent, a dirty Canadian trick intended to fool American voters and influence U.S. Supreme Court justices about to judge a major federal tariff case. Since becoming president in January 2025, Donald Trump has made tariffs the centerpiece of U.S. trade policy and sparked a trade war with Canada by levying them on Canadian goods. Evidently, Trump wants the U.S. public to believe his views are aligned with one of the most popular and transformative presidents, Democrat or Republican, in U.S. history, Ronald Reagan. So who was the real Ronald Reagan, the B-movie actor who became the great communicator, the man who never lost an election, the one-time New Deal Democrat who became the standard-bearer of the conservative movement, the hardline Cold Warrior and anti-communist turned peacemaker who supported brutal proxy wars in Central America, the president who called apartheid in South Africa morally wrong and yet vetoed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986, which Congress had passed with bipartisan support. The self-proclaimed tax cutter who, as president, raised taxes nearly a dozen times to balance the books. The free market champion who bailed out and subsidized corporations. What did this man, so full of contradictions, actually think? And why does he continue to play such an outsized role in contemporary politics? I'm joined now by Carleton University history professor Andrew Johnston, an expert on U.S. political history, to help us answer these questions about Ronald Reagan. Professor Andrew Johnston, welcome to In Bed with the Elephant.
Thanks for having me.
Andrew, Ronald Reagan is a giant in the U.S. political pantheon. He's widely regarded by his supporters and critics alike as being one of the most consequential presidents in the history of the 20th century. You've been watching this rather astonishing rhetorical tug-of-war pitting Ontario Premier Doug Ford against U.S. President Donald Trump. Ford says that Ronald Reagan was clearly against tariffs. Donald Trump has said the opposite, insisting that Ronald Reagan loved tariffs. Who's got Reagan's position on tariffs and trade right?
I'd really hate to side with Doug Ford, but I have to here on this. If you grew up in the 1980s, as I did at university, there was no mistaking what Reagan and Thatcher and Brian Mulroney in Canada, what they were about, and that was trade liberalization. And that became vogue in the 1980s in the major industrial economies of the Western world, certainly. And Reagan and Thatcher together brought that into the international economy. Part of that was to accept the idea that we needed freer trade so that capital could flow around the world where it was most logically going to flow, that businesses could invest in places where labor was cheaper when it wasn't cheap at home. That accelerated a process that had really begun in the late 60s, early 70s of the deindustrialization of the United States.
And the argument was that this was about accelerating the entrepreneurial spirit.
Indeed. And there would be long-term tax benefits and revenues that would come in, even if you tax the super rich less than you did before. There would be more wealth circulating, and in the long run, everyone, as they say, all boats would rise as a result of this increase in capital activity around the world. But it would require, some adjustments.
What's the context in which this radio address that Reagan gave in 1987, what's the context in which this is happening? Because Reagan seems to be saying two things. He seems to support tariffs, but also denigrate tariffs. So can you kind of parse that for us? Like, what's going on?
Sure. So it was a very specific dispute with Japan over semiconductors and dumping of semiconductors, which is less important than the argument that you're getting at. And that is, on the one hand, he's saying, we're going to raise tariffs because we're in a dispute with you right now over this in order to encourage you to back down on an agreement that we'd had earlier.
Tit for tat.
So it's really a bargaining tool in a very particular moment. But then the majority of the message is undeniably then a return to the idea that America's committed to free trade and reducing tariffs everywhere. So we're doing this to convince you to do what we want to do too, and that is to reduce any tariff barrier, direct or indirect, that we may be engaged in. Let's all open up free trade. And it's impossible for me to imagine how any Republican today could forget that was central to Reagan's message on the economy back in the 1980s.
Did Ronald Reagan have an economic philosophy?
It's questionable that Ronald Reagan had a philosophy at all. Let's be clear.
Okay.
Let's be clear.
Okay.
I mean, he had a kind of bucolic view of American life that came out of growing up, admittedly, in hard times in the 1930s. And
grew up in the Midwest.
In the Midwest, in Illinois, right? Yeah. You know, he came from a modest background and he was self-made in a lot of respects. I mean, yeah, admittedly as an actor, but he did well and went to Hollywood.
But yeah, he's a product of the working class. His father was a shoe salesman.
Yeah, for sure. He had that narrative in mind and a remembrance of America that was better than the one that he felt he was seeing in the 1970s and early 80s. And so I wouldn't say it was an economic philosophy per se, but it was a kind of trapped in amber view of American life that he had inherited through that middle part of the century when America became the richest country in the world by far. It seemed to be helping other countries around the world to deal with socialism in Europe and Russia and China, or communism. And so there was a narrative that went to it rather than a specific philosophy that celebrated American entrepreneurialism and the individual. And a lot of this was kind of movie rhetoric that he imported from scripts that he'd read. The things he did as an actor were consistent with this image of a country that was once simpler and better, and there should be a way back to that. And if we can just release American entrepreneurial spirit that had stood astride the globe in the 1950s, then we'd be fine. So that's as far as it got. I think by all admission, the people who worked with him on economic policy would admit that he didn't necessarily think very hard about these things.
There's a reason, I think, why Donald Trump has reacted so strongly to Doug Ford and the Ontario government using Ronald Reagan in this ad to go after his policy on tariffs. I think Donald Trump understands that Ronald Reagan matters in U.S. politics and U.S. history, and that he needs to make sure that he's on Ronald Reagan's side. Ronald Reagan, left politics, 37 years ago, 1988, and yet he still seems to be part of the conversation. He's been called the Republican FDR, the Republican Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Barack Obama said this about Reagan in 2008, quote, "I think Ronald Reagan changed the trajectory of America in a way that, Richard Nixon did not, and in a way that Bill Clinton did not." For those people who might not be as familiar, who weren't around like you were when Reagan was in power, why are we still talking about Ronald Reagan? Why was he such a consequential president and politician that we're talking about him in 2025?
Well, historians talk about the Reagan Revolution in the 1980s. And so it was a conversation between him and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, between the legacy of the great Democratic president who got America out of the Great Depression and through the Second World War. So he's considered consequential because of institutional changes that he made to American life, not just happening also to be president during those momentous events, but substantially altering the way Americans thought about the moral economy of the nation and what the government could do to address social problems. If America had been, before the Great Depression in the 1920s and back into the 19th century, the 1890s, Donald Trump's favorite decade in American history, it was a pretty rough place in a lot of ways, very, very prosperous, but very iniquitous. Not just on racial gender issues, but just economically. But it was still perceived as a land of opportunity, that you could make it rich in the country. The Depression had cast great doubt on that. And Roosevelt, much like Reagan, used his charm and his confidence and communication skills on radio to hold the country together. He also was not an economic philosopher. He was a pragmatist and a tinkerer, and he basically said, try something. If it works, keep it. If it doesn't work, try something else. He was very conscious of the vulnerability of American people. And I think partly because his own disability showed the capriciousness of life, that people aren't necessarily poor and unfortunate because they lack morality or they lack effort. But that's how the economy and how life sometimes works for people. And so he brought that compassion to his policies and managed to convince Americans that there are things the state could do. So by 1980, with the recession and the perception of the weaknesses of the Carter administration on both domestic and foreign issues, they were ready to hear his message of saying there was a time when America was better, and I'm going to bring it back to you. And ironically, bring it back to you not by celebrating the Roosevelt era that had helped him and helped America in the 1930s and 40s, but by reversing that and saying we need to unleash all the things that the government had become the problem. That was his famous inaugural address, where the government wasn't the solution, but was the problem.
So up until the early 1960s, he's a Democrat. I know that there's a famous speech that he gives in 1964 in support of Barry Goldwater, who, of course, was the Republican candidate for president in the election against Lyndon Johnson. He famously loses that election. Reagan is kind of identified by the Republican grandees, of the party as being an up-and-comer. And by 1966, he becomes governor of California, a Republican governor of California. I don't think, though, it's a coincidence that a year before he becomes the governor of California, the Watts riots happen, 1965, which for a lot of white folks in America was terrifying. That act of rebellion on the part of predominantly young black people who were fed up with the kind of oppressive conditions in which they were living, police brutality in California at the time. Can you maybe talk a little bit about just that civil rights moment? Because Reagan himself had been opposed to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and he also opposed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He made the argument that it was about preserving states' rights, but that suggested that perhaps he was using race in some way to advance his own political interests. Is that harsh? Too harsh?
No, I don't think so. I think it's played out in the way he coded race when he was president as well. I think that became part of it, and why he was actually, endorsed. He rejected the endorsement of the Klan at some point in I think it was before his 1980 presidential run.
And he did launch his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which was where the Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney, the three civil rights workers, had been found murdered.
Yeah. So there's no denying that he was aware of these symbols. He was not going to be openly so, but he was coding it in ways that were easily read by his audience. I mean, absolutely, Watts was enormously significant, and not the only one. There were dozens of urban riots across the United States, closer to home, Detroit,
Newark,
all across the country. And it became a symbol of the failure of democratic policies as well to do something about
and a sign of
things.
a decline of the country.
Yeah.
Right.
So all of the optimism of the 1950s that we were so prosperous suddenly in the 1960s, and 65 was also, of course, the year when Johnston escalated the American involvement in Vietnam. The most troops started going over. This is when he publicly admitted they were involved. At that time, these were not anti-war protests. That was not in people's line of sight until maybe 68. So that was before that. But the thing about these urban riots is Americans, for the most part, were not always aware of their own cities because they were so segregated. And until it's on the news, until you actually see those images of cops dealing with rioters in Los Angeles or in Newark or in Detroit, it doesn't bring home to you just how bad the country actually is, what's going on. If you're white, middle class, or working class, you're not living in the same neighborhoods. You're not having the same experiences, and so you don't understand it. You understand the violence and the disruption, and I think much of what happened in the 1970s was middle American voters saying, we don't know how we feel about Vietnam, whether we're for it or against it, but we know it's causing stress at home. It's causing riots. We don't like the way young people are behaving. We don't like the way people in inner cities are behaving. We don't like the idea of busing. We don't like the idea of affirmative action. But we also don't want to be called racist. So we're going to try to figure out a way to elect a leader who will stop those things, bring peace to our cities, bring prosperity and job security, restore an America that they sort of vaguely remember from television and movies.
Restore America's confidence because that confidence had been battered, I think, as you alluded to. The Vietnam War had a real effect on the American psyche. There's a sense that America, the city on the hill, is in decline.
Yeah.
And that the possibility that America could be a beacon for the world seemed to be fading.
Vietnam was contested. I mean, and there are people who remained supportive of the war to the end. They just, as I said, wanted an end to the chaos it was creating. But it happened. So the Americans withdrew in 1973, which was the same year that Watergate breaks open. So Americans are beset with these twin crises in their vision of themselves. And they're basically moral crises. So we failed at a war. Korea was a foreshadowing of how difficult it was going to be for America to continue to sit astride the globe and bring the international order it wanted. This is not the great social commitment that Americans made in 1941. And again, they were late to the First and Second World Wars, so it wasn't obvious that they were going to play this role in the world. But they had come in the aftermath of the Second World War to see themselves that way and thought, okay, we don't really understand what's going on in Southeast Asia, but we'll support our country, right or wrong. We think it's on the right side of things. And as the images of the war itself begin coming back, as the stories of what American GIs were experiencing but also doing, as the moral certainty of it became fuzzier, and then as protests against it happened, and Kent State shooting happened, right? Students protesting. This was the expansion of the war into Cambodia. It really disturbed American voters. And regardless of
particularly white voters,
who saw this as a collapse of domestic order, they were not willing to admit the failure of foreign policy, but they were willing to blame someone for it. And they would have said, well, it must have been because the young people and the black people are protesting and they're weakening us from within. So there was a bit of that. But then the Watergate scandal comes along about the same time, and the American people become deeply disillusioned with government, period. So For a political candidate to come along in the late 1970s saying that government is the problem and we are going to get out of your way and let you live the life you want to live, which means we're not going to be pursuing affirmative action. We're not going to be trying to push racial desegregation. We're going to allow the economy to boom. We're not going to regulate the environment as much as we might have either. There are all sorts of things that would focus on economic activity and let Americans do what they do best, which is make things and sell things and make themselves rich. And that appealed to enough voters, for sure.
But it was more than that, wasn't it? That perhaps the country was hankering for a particular kind of leadership. It was hankering for someone who would boost their spirits. And Ronald Reagan seemed to be made for the job. You talked about FDR being a great communicator. Ronald Reagan understood how to talk to people. He understood how to engage with ordinary folks. He had a sunny disposition. Yeah. He had a sense of possibility. He thought that the best days for America were ahead. That must have been a very seductive message for people at that particular moment in history.
Absolutely. And to his credit, I mean, he was all of these things. I mean, as someone who at the time was a young student who was skeptical of the content of the message, I knew whenever he said something that a large fictitious story was not far behind, that he often said things that were palpably untrue. And there was a book I remember buying in the early 80s called Reagan's Reign of Error, which is just a long anthology of quotations of his that were just factually incorrect. Mostly because he may have believed they were correct or things he'd heard. There were little stories and anecdotes. He sometimes confused reality with movie scripts that he'd read. And he openly said, the point is not to be true. It's to tell the good story because this is what people need.
Was he right?
Well, to his credit, and this is what I'll say about American historians, every once in a while gather, or C-SPAN gathers them together and has them rank American presidents. And it's a fun exercise, particularly because as Donald Trump is having to live with the idea that American historians don't rank him very highly. He's always at the bottom of these polls. But Reagan is somewhere in around 10th. It could be higher, given the perception that he has, particularly amongst Republicans now. It could be much higher. But his reputation has been improving over the last few years.
How come?
I think because of what's come since. So at the time, you see the Iran-Contra scandal, which I was in graduate school in the United States when that was unfolding.
Can you just briefly explain what that was?
So essentially, the United States was banned by congressional law, by the Boland Amendment, from sending money to Nicaraguan right-wing revolutionaries known as the Contras. Reagan was determined to support the Contras, even though his advisors saying you can't, it breaks congressional law. It is illegal to do that. So that scandal unfolded in his second term, and there were hearings about what Reagan knew and when he knew it. Was he aware that this was going on underneath him? And anyway, so that hurt his reputation in the long run, for sure. What I was going to say was, in terms of the way presidents rank him retrospectively, they rank him very low for his administration. He was not in touch with what was going on around him.
He wasn't interested.
He was not interested.
It wasn't his thing.
He couldn't pay attention to things that were in front of him. He didn't have serious thoughts about them. But he was really good at reading a script and communicating with people. So
and he wrote his own scripts
And he wrote his own scripts, and he knew how to deliver them in a way. It's quite refreshing to actually hear him. Even in that address, I was struck in 1987, quite late in his presidency, how articulate. Yeah, I know he's reading it, but he was a very articulate.
Very warm and very genial kind of person.
Yeah. So this was all very good. And the context why historians rank that highly in particular, and having a sense of vision of restoring America on the world stage, was also restoring the presidency after the 1970s, after Watergate.
After Jimmy Carter.
But the whole office of the presidency had fallen into disrepute because of the corruption of Nixon and the fecklessness of Carter, or the perceived fecklessness of Carter.
He was seen as being weak somehow.
Yeah. I mean, he was undeniably, he has this great post-presidential career where he redeems himself to a considerable degree, and his presidency has been viewed a little bit better. But nonetheless, what Reagan did that appeals to American historians is to reestablish the credibility and moral authority of the presidency. Even if you don't agree with what he was fighting for and what he wanted to do, or you disagree with his economic policies or his foreign policies, nonetheless, he restored the respect that the American people had for that office and set the stage for what other future presidents could do if they wanted to.
Ronald Reagan was a bundle of contradictions because in the 80s, and I do remember the 1980s, he was seen in some quarters as being representing danger, right? Like he was someone who was potentially a warmonger. He was someone who you couldn't trust around the nuclear button.
Yeah.
He was someone who could set the whole thing off. He was seen as being maybe simplistic in the way in which his understanding of the world. He had this kind of Manichaean view, like good versus evil. But this is the person who ends up creating space for a kind of a rapprochement with his enemy, the Soviet Union. Yeah. He's the one who ends up helping to end the Cold War, which had bedeviled the world for so long. He is the one who makes advances in nuclear disarmament as well. How do you understand the kind of contradictory elements of Ronald Reagan? How do you make sense of that?
It's not easy. All that is true. There were different interpretations as to how he journeyed from his very hawkish first term into a much more diplomatic second term. And the first term produced some of the largest anti-nuclear protests in the world, particularly in Europe. They were very worried about him. I don't know if you remember the British TV show Spitting Image.
I do.
They had a cartoonish version of Thatcher and Reagan was always in his pajamas, and beside his bed was the red button, and he'd always be absentmindedly groping for something on and it was this perception that he really had no idea what was going on, and he didn't necessarily understand the intricacies of nuclear arms negotiations. So those of us who were interested in international affairs were kind of despondent by 1984. By the time that the second election was occurring, we thought this was not going to be a presidency, if he was reelected, that was going to produce anything useful in foreign policy or in international affairs. And of course, we were shocked and surprised to discover that it did. It ended the Cold War.
How did he do it?
Well,
how did he contribute to it?
We're all divided on this. There are a number of different opinions, so I can give you both. On the right, it's because his hawkishness forced the Soviet Union to come to terms with the contradictions in its own economy. Gorbachev wanted to make economic reforms, and he knew he couldn't do it unless he curbed the military budget. And so that meant getting out of Afghanistan. That meant reducing their arms expenditures, the size of the Red Army in general.
The Soviet Union essentially couldn't compete with the United States.
That was the perception. So the conservative view is that Reagan forced Gorbachev to come begging for a settlement and got it. And Reagan famously went to Berlin and asked for the wall to come down.
Tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev.
Wall. And within a few years, it actually happened. That happened under Reagan, and it happened because he was astute enough to realize that he could deal with Gorbachev, and that Gorbachev was a genuine modernizer, not a traditional child of the Stalinist era. That was an important thing that he was able to pick up, that he wasn't so ideologically hidebound afterwards that he would miss that opportunity. So he does deserve certainly credit for that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There were some other contradictions about Reagan. He denounced big government, but ends up making it bigger. He's a champion of fiscal conservatism. He inherits a deficit of, $80 billion. And in 8 years, he increased the deficit to $200 billion. How do we make sense of those seeming contradictions?
I think Reagan was not sophisticated enough to worry about those kinds of contradictions. He believed that cutting spending, so the traditional Republican mantra is balanced budget. Through the 20th century, that had always been their thing. They were fiscally conservative. In the era of Reagan, the military was trying to recover its post-Vietnam reputation. And he was trying to spend the Soviets or outspend the Soviets, so America was never perceived as being weak again and would flex its muscle in places like Grenada, unsuccessfully in Lebanon, and other places in the world where it never really translated into something viable. But nonetheless, the idea that you had the latest weapons, the M1 that was one of his major missiles, so the B-1, B-2 bombers, these very expensive projects that were perceived to keep America well ahead of its adversaries. He just unplugged that need from the other side of his equation, which is we're going to cut spending. So we're going to cut government spending on social programs and other things that will affect the working class in America. But we're going to spend massively on the military and will therefore maintain a deficit. And his own advisor said he could never look seriously at it.
He changed the tax code as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was definitely siphoning money up to the top.
Yeah.
And if you look at the charts which trace income inequality in America was at its lowest around the 1940s and 50s. It was very, very high in the 1920s, and one of the causes of the Great Depression. Begins to close in the 1950s and 60s, begins to open up again in the 1970s, and becomes astronomically large after the Reagan era. So that's definitely one of his legacies.
How do you compare a Ronald Reagan with a Donald Trump? So what are some of their similarities and what are some of their perhaps more glaring differences?
I've thought about that, and I've thought about the question of communication, because Reagan, as we've talked about, had that mellifluous way of speaking, of making people feel good about themselves. Even when he was criticizing abstractly government or welfare cheats or whatever, he was celebrating American virtues and talking to people at a level that comforted them and made them feel like, yeah, America's good at heart. Despite Watergate, despite Vietnam, we have goodness that will be restored. Trump, he's not as articulate. He has a very kind of limited vocabulary, but he has a way of speaking that's very direct and effective with his followers. They like his forthrightness, that he speaks his mind.
He's unfiltered.
And we've been feeling like politicians are mealy-mouthed and constantly equivocating and using talking points. And Trump doesn't do that. He just speaks. And he speaks the way I presume he speaks often to people around him. And so at some level, it's sort of refreshing for people who think the way he does, that finally there's a politician who's unguarded and doesn't care what people are going to say and can fight with that kind of language. But his modes of communication also are the internet and social media. So he's the first president to sort of engage with the people directly by using all caps, shouting his disdain for people around him, for his critics and so on. And so he's not attempting to bridge the gap between him and other people in a way that I think Reagan, even though he was pushing and polarizing in a lot of ways, still had room to work across the floor with Democrats. He was leveraging his popularity to put pressure on Democrats to realize that he was more popular than they were on a lot of issues. But he just had a friendlier disposition. Trump comes across as angry and distasteful and very egotistical.
It's interesting because they both come out of show business in many ways. They're both performers. Ronald Reagan apparently once told Warren Beatty, among others, that, quote, he couldn't understand how anyone could be president without first being an actor. Yeah. He was a real performer. He was a performer, but somehow it didn't seem performative.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think it was performative in that the gap between the things he said and reality is really hard to get over. You can't get past the fact that he said things about America that were demonstrably untrue or things that happened that were untrue. So it was irksome to hear them and say, do you really believe that people are on the street because they actually have good homes and jobs, but they're too lazy to have them? Is that the way you really see the world? Or are you saying that because you want to find a justification to cut social services?
He talked about welfare queens.
All the time. And it was central to his change because, as you said, he had been a supporter of the New Deal. He had been at least seemed to be more or less a supporter of the Great Society or parts of it, maybe not the racial side of it. And then somehow in the late 60s, early 70s, all that goes out the window, and the working poor that he worshipped in the 1930s and 40s were suddenly welfare sponges.
Both Trump and Reagan seem to be much more aligned with the corporate class than with the laboring classes. In 1981, Ronald Reagan tries to break the back of labor by going after air traffic controllers. And this is just a couple years before Margaret Thatcher, his great friend and comrade, she breaks the backs of the miners in 83, 84. Is there some similarity between how Trump engages with working peoples and the way Reagan did?
So Reagan's approach to the air traffic controllers. That was a federal union, right? That was a government union. So he took the view that he had the power to fire them in a way that he wouldn't have interfered necessarily in other labor disputes with the same draconian sense. But
he fired 11,000. I think 11,000 people lose their jobs.
Yeah, he gave them the opportunity to go back now or you lose your job, and they lost the ones who didn't go back lost their jobs. Certainly, it was known that he was hostile to labor, and that was the perception that labor was holding American capital back by maintaining high labor costs, which was central to his economic policies. I mean, my sense is that Trump uses the culture wars to speak to working Americans more than economic theory. You can certainly make the case that if you raise tariffs, the jobs will come back to America in some sectors. In places and parts of America where the jobs have been lost 20, 30 years ago anyway. So they're not restoring jobs that have been recently lost, but somehow bringing good manufacturing jobs back. But those good manufacturing jobs were good because they were unionized and they paid well and they could support the towns around them. So it's not clear that he's necessarily committed to that. But I think his popularity in his parts of America rests to a considerable degree on the way he talks, the way he perceives himself as self-made and wealthy. And you all want to live like me. I'm surrounding myself in the White House. I'm gilding it in gold to show how successful I have been. And I do want
$300 million on a ballroom.
And I want to remind everybody, and I had to remind myself, that Reagan's inaugural ball was deliberately lavish and expensive and full of gold and full of the symbols of wealth. Not because he wanted to show off his success and his wealth, but because he wanted to remind Americans that he's not a working class. He's not Jimmy Carter rolling up his sleeves, taking his tie off. Now's the time to put on tuxedos and ball gowns. The dawning of a new America.
Morning in America.
Morning in America.
Morning
right
in
here.
America,
That's right.
yeah.
And Morning in America was going to be happy, and it starts at the White House, and we're going to show you things are okay. So there was symbolism in a lot of that, displays of wealth. And I think Trump kind of tries to do the same thing, although it's more focused on him specifically, that I am successful, I am rich, I'm making deals all the time. People are giving me gifts like airplanes, and this is because I'm really successful. And so you should follow me and trust me because this is my life. And we're going to bracket the bankruptcies and other things in the criminal record by displays of visible displays of wealth.
Ronald Reagan had a different relationship with Canada than Donald Trump. Donald Trump's current relationship with this country. What do you think Ronald Reagan would make of the way in which Donald Trump has approached relations with Canada?
I think he'd be probably appalled at how ham-fisted it's been and counterproductive. I mean, they were looking for different things. Ronald Reagan was trying to negotiate a free trade agreement with Canada.
With Brian Mulroney.
With Brian Mulroney. And Donald Trump is trying to do the opposite, trying to raise tariffs between the two, to reverse basically what Reagan and Mulroney had negotiated in the mid-1980s.
The Shamrock Summit.
I remember it well. I remember the pictures of them on the Citadel of Quebec City, and
two Irish boys.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, singing "Irish Eyes Are Smiling." Yeah. Right. Yeah. So that's inconceivable now with the current administration, which has openly perceives Canada as a kind of enemy in terms of we mistreat it on trade all the time. Somehow we're screwing Americans, and not an ally who he wants to be friends. He likes Canadians. He says that, but he's far more erratic in terms of the way he deals with Canada. And also, I mean, I don't think either of them necessarily knew a great deal about Canada. There aren't many presidents who do. I don't see anything in common between the two presidents in terms of their views of Canada. And I think what I thought was interesting about Doug Ford's play was that it really puts the fox and the chickens in the Republican Party about what Reagan's legacy is. And maybe this is what interested you about this story in the first place, is that it asks some very uncomfortable questions about the Trump administration and its relationship to this legacy president. The paradox is that Donald Trump is pursuing economic policies which the Democrats would have fought for in the early 80s against Reagan, of trying to protect American workers. I don't think he's doing it because of any sincere commitment to American workers, but the symbolism of restoring American greatness by restoring jobs that were once here 30, 40 years ago, as peculiar as it is, it was peculiar even for the Democrats to have to imagine, how are we going to do this when we're losing jobs to Japan, when we're losing jobs to Korea and other parts of the world in the 1980s. Once the globalization horse is out of the barn, very hard to put it back in.
Andrew Johnston, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me again, Adrian.
You've been listening to In Bed with the Elephant, a production of Ricochet Media. Let us know what you think about our show by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, iHeartRadio, YouTube, or wherever you find your podcasts. The producer, editor, and sound engineer of In Bed with the Elephant is Dave Sarrazin. Executive producers, Ethan Cox and Andrea Houston. Music, Parker Harewood. Graphics, Connor Kaloran. I'm Adrian Harewood. See you next time.
We want to do this because we feel both Japan and the United States have an obligation to promote the prosperity and economic development that only free trade can bring. Now, that message of free trade is one I conveyed to Canada's leaders a few weeks ago, and it was warmly received there.